Welcome to this very special Iowa Writers Workshop celebration honoring Connie Brothers. Yay. To those workshop alumni of years past who have traveled from afar to be here today, my name is Samantha Chang, and I've been the director of the workshop since 2006. On behalf of the workshop and my predecessors as director who worked with Connie, Jack Leggett, and Frank Conroy, I'd like to give everyone a warm welcome. Today we have in attendance workshop alumni from 1967 to 2019. Yeah, woo! We have alumni coming from as far away as Paris and Dubai. And we're all here to honor and celebrate Connie Brothers, a woman who has been the heart and soul of the Iowa Writers Workshop for 45 years. Woo! We have several distinguished speakers on the program today, but first, I would like to make a few remarks. Like many of us here, I have a story about how I first met Connie Brothers. She introduced herself to me in February 1991 when she called to tell me that the program wanted to admit me and give me a TA, but that I hadn't filled out the form. For 2 years after that, I knew her as a student, and for 3 semesters in the late 90s and early aughts, I knew her from the perspective of a visiting faculty member. When I was a student, Connie was powerful and mysterious. A nature goddess, she lived way out in the country with her daughter, Cammie, her husband, Bill, and several cats. She ate containers of brown rice for lunch. She smoked American Spirit cigarettes. She loved to ask about our problems, and she was also famously private. She knew as much about the literary world as anyone alive. She had eaten breakfast with Borges. She was, really. She was good friends with Robert Hass and Claudia Rankine. She was an expert on the phone. She had an unrivaled Rolodex that contained 2, 3, or 4 phone numbers each for famous people. Years later, as a visiting faculty member, I began to see Connie as the workshop's secret superpower. But I did not truly see the depth of Connie's wisdom and humanity until I became program director. How is it possible that a community of notoriously fragile and complex people did not turn against itself and harden into the bitter, infertile rivalries I had, by this time, witnessed firsthand at several other creative writing institutions? How is it possible that over decades of organizational and financial tumult in the academy that have crippled so many once first-class arts programs, the Iowa Writers Workshop has consistently turned out so many exceptional poets and fiction writers? Who is at the core of the program's extraordinary achievement over the last 45 years? I believe that this person is, to a large extent, Connie Brothers. I am fortunate that for more than a dozen years, I have had the privilege of speaking to Connie for hours at a time, 5 days a week. During those years, I conversed with Connie more than with any other human being. Technically, as she told people, I was her boss, but in reality, she has been the mentor and advisor of my adult life. Here's a bit of what I have learned about her. Connie came to Iowa City with her small daughter, Cammie, in the early 70s. She taught children at Willow in school. According to Jack Leggett, director from 1970 to 87, He ran into her one day at the co-op and asked her if she wanted to work for the program. Connie says she thinks Jack hired her because he had witnessed her patiently walking a drunken visiting author back and forth at a party. As director, Jack had a great gift for choosing the right people. He made many brilliant choices and hires as director, but he told me shortly before he died at 97 that Connie was the best one. Connie is a Buddhist, and she has taught me that it's best not to accumulate karma. Although she is a Buddhist, Connie also has a tolerance for lucky charms. When we were required to renumber our courses, she let me use the Chinese lucky number 8. When she encouraged me in my efforts to wear red because it brings good luck. So many hundreds of times we knocked on the wood. First, on the desktop, and then on the sides of desks, and then on the floor, according to what people told us really worked. Connie is a genius at talking to sensitive people, and she showed many of us through endlessly repeated examples how not to hurt people's feelings. We're not successful all the time, but when we screw up, she has usually been around to help sort things out. Most crucially, Connie believes in the significance and value of writing. She knows that poetry is more important than bureaucracy. And she worked to ensure that we were writing in an environment where the details privileged human beings and their art making over hoop jumping, red tape, and official protocol. As an example of this, in our first phone call, Connie did not make me feel bad that I had not filled out the required TA application form. My writing was more important than the form. She understood that the form was not an end, but a means to an end, which was bringing another writer to Iowa. To the extent that she was able, she protected us, and she looked out for more than the writers in the Iowa Writers Workshop. She understood the value of writing to this university, and her protection of us benefited the university as much as it enabled art and art making. She was a force for equality in many ways. She was also a tireless champion for the voices of women in the time when the workshop was 60 or 70% men. Meanwhile, for decades, the rhythm of the program office, of the lives of people in it, such as myself, Deb, Jan, Kelly, Leah, and Sasha, has been defined by Connie's preferences. We have lunch a lot. We have a lot of food in the office and outside the office because, as Virginia Woolf once wrote, one cannot sleep well, love well, or think well if they have not dined well. We do not poison ants or mice. We can call Connie if someone is in trouble. Here are a few more details. Connie has kept the Norfolk pine in the front lounge alive for at least 30 years. Connie also persuaded the university to give us windows that actually open, even though maintenance has since removed the cranks. It is because of Connie that the Glenn Schaefer Library has real wood floors and not plastic flooring. Thank you, Connie. When I lost my mother 5 years ago, Connie told me that there's a window of time after the death of a parent when people can see with complete clarity what truly matters to them. In this way, she helped me rediscover a regular and productive practice as a novelist. Thank you, Connie. Connie, when you retire, we're going to try not to get into fights. We will keep trying to shield writers against bureaucracy. We'll keep fighting to make sure that writing is the most important thing. We'll keep eating a lot. We're going to use spreadsheets now, but we'll keep knocking on the wood. We are going to miss you so very much. We love you, Connie. And now I would like to introduce our first guest speaker, the novelist Chris Adrian.
Hi, everybody. Not very long after I started learning to be a palliative care pediatrician, my mentor took me out for a beer. It was the first of a series of check-ins around my education, around my mental and spiritual health, and around my intellectual and emotional discernment. Mostly he was checking in on my understanding of what it was we really did, because there was some subtlety about it, and I could tell he was worried that even many months into it, I didn't really get it. It's more than the drugs, he told me. It's more than the medicine. It's like the hospital with a capital H. The whole system really understood at some point how brutal it could be to people when they showed up here at their most vulnerable. How it could really torture the people it was ostensibly trying to help and heal, how it could really grind them down. So it set some folks aside, it set us aside, it set aside this space to take care of people, to take a certain kind of care of them, even though at the same time it couldn't quite yet commit to not brutalizing them. Is this making any sense? He asked me. We want to be like 11 in the big system. We want to try to see people for who they really are and watch out for them, to protect them, and help them flourish during what might be the most challenging time of their lives. Is it making sense, he asked again. If my face was doing something funny, it was only because what he was describing sounded in a way very familiar. Sure, I said. We're kind of like Connie. Who's Connie? He asked. A few years later, in a different but not unrelated context, my mentor at shaman camp took me aside after class to talk about a point of practice because a question I had asked during class had raised concern for her that I wasn't quite getting it. A power animal, she said, is a helping spirit that is interested in you for reasons that are entirely benevolent. Even before you meet it, even before it announces itself to you by appearing to you at least 4 times during a journey to the lower world, it may already have been looking out for you. It may already have been asking itself in loving kindness what it can do for you to the best of its ability here in middle world where everything is so mixed and so complicated, where our joys and griefs are often so entwined that they might seem sometimes like the same thing. The thing about a power animal, she went on, is that it really doesn't have any motivation besides helping a person thrive and flourish in their context, however complex or complicated their context might happen to be. They look out for us in their invisible, unaggrandizing, unjudging way. Is this making sense? She asked me, as if she might be about to offer me a little remedial drumming. But again, the funny look on my face was a sign of recognition, not confusion. Sure, I said, that sounds like Connie. Who's Connie? She asked. Is Connie one of your power animals? And she reminded me that power animals usually had names like bear, or owl, or meerkat, not Connie or Mabel or George. And another year or so later, in a training for a method of somatic psychotherapy that tries to help people by fostering a sort of mindful and friendly diplomacy with their unconscious mind and the memories and feelings carried around in their bodies, an assistant took me and a couple of my peers aside to talk in more detail about the idea of the magical stranger, because she worried that we might not all be getting it. The magical stranger, she said, emerges from the persona of the therapist into the bubble of trust and safety around the client, who recognizes it in their child's state of vulnerability as a wise, non-judgmental presence, trustworthy both because of its competence. It's been helping like this. It's been helping all sorts of people like this in their child states for years and years and years, maybe even 45 years. And because its agenda is one of total naked affection. Is this making sense? The assistant asked us, and we all nodded. Sure, said one of my peers, it sounds like if Mr. Rogers and Hillary Clinton had a baby. It sounds like my mother, said the other. And I said, it sounds like Connie. Who's Connie? They asked. What I said to all these people when I tried to explain about Connie was that when I was very young, I landed in a state of abject and exquisite vulnerability at a wonderful institution that even while it was trying to give me precious gifts of artistic discernment and maturity, was also kind of trying, maybe because it sort of had to give me a nervous breakdown. And yet also at that same time, while it manifested as if, and yet also at the same time, it had manifested as if by fiat of the very spirit of loving kindness, an individual secretly commissioned to hold a particular kind of safe space for me and for all my peers. Somebody not entwined with our writing, but somebody who clearly loved all our individual stories. Somebody who clearly loved all our individual lives. All my own nervous breakdowns came much later, I said. But if I had had one back then, I would have been in very good hands with someone who knew just how to put in place an extra layer of support, how to be a non-anxious and non-judgmental presence, somebody who had already thought out a plan of care for all of us. So when you ask me if these notions make sense to me of a countercurrent of solicitous kindness or a supremely capable wisdom that's deeply interested in being good to you, I can say that it makes sense because I've met all these notions and tendencies and processes that you're describing, that as I learn more fully and more finally about how to really take care of people, the example of one person becomes more and more universally instructive. And that person is Connie Brothers. It's rather bad news for an ordinary body when its heart retires. So what happens to an extraordinary body like the workshop when its heart moves out of the building? I think everyone must all be similarly anxious and sad and hugely, hugely grateful. I keep thinking everyone will just have to take care of each other now. And then I think, well, of course, everyone has already started to do that. It's been going on for years already. And she's been teaching us by example this whole time how to take care of each other. And it's so different anyway than when I was here as a kid. It's almost as if someone had a beautiful vision for the place that's come to lovely fruition in exactly the right time. And then I think, thank you for showing us how to do it, Connie. And then I think, thank you for showing me what loving kindness is. And then I just think, thank you, Connie. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be poetry professor James Galvin.
Okay, yes, too loud? Sometime circa 1923, Wallace Stevens placed a jar in Tennessee. Personally, when Wallace Stevens says, quote, "I placed a jar in Tennessee," end quote, I don't believe him. Not for a minute. I mean, who places a jar in Tennessee? And what are the contents of the jar? If it's just atmosphere, you don't need a jar to hold it. It can't be nothing, that would be a vacuum, and we can't do vacuums. Stevens never tells us what is in the jar, if anything. We assume that it is empty, but what happens in the poem, the jar, which is round, tall, gray, and bare, makes Tennessee surrounded, sprawling, no longer chaos. It doesn't matter what is in the jar, only the jar matters. It is the ideal of poetic form, waiting for the actual poetic imagination to fill it, an object waiting for an essence. Here's the poem. It's only 12 lines, and probably many of you studied it in school. Anecdote of the jar. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and a port of air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. What does Stevens's jar have in common with Connie Brothers? I'll tell you. Sometime circa 1974, our director, Jack Leggett, placed Connie in the writer's workshop just as Stevens placed his jar in Tennessee, only more literally. And the same thing happened. It made, quote, "it made that slovenly wilderness surround the hill," end quote. I was a student in the workshop at the time, slovenly, wild, and I didn't notice anything. But looking back over 45 years of working closely with Connie, who became far more than a colleague to me, it's easy to see the larger picture. First, the students began to orbit around her, andante, as she answered their practical questions and addressed their personal problems. Connie's office was the ivory emergency room. She handled everything, and when she couldn't handle it herself, she always knew who to call. Knowing who to call, or who to call upon, is in itself a kind of genius. Shepherded students who were vulnerable through their fear of each other and of the program. I was recently talking to a young poet who said that without Connie, she never would have made it through. A not uncommon sentiment. Soon the faculty began to orbit, especially the visitors, but really all of us. Connie was indeed the gravitational center of the workshop, the force that allowed its wilderness to survive in a larger academic environment that doesn't like wilderness. Connie was the center around which the workshop revolved for 45 years. Students, by now thousands of them, teachers, by now hundreds, directors, 3, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the town euphemistically referred to as Iowa City, and outward and into the world with every student who graduates and becomes a writer. Nobody knows where the unassuming jar derives its power. Okay, it's the imagination and the emptiness that wants to be filled by artifice. Connie wants to know everything, and she does. But she doesn't ever blab. Not ever. You know anybody else who knows everything and doesn't blab? Not ever. Second, cryptography. How many of you have seen Connie's handwriting? Connie is an expert cryptologist. But here's a secret. Connie, when she wants to, can write quite clearly. Third, no paper trails outside of those required by the larger institution, the one that doesn't like wildness. She uses the phone. She is an undercover operator. Fourth, archaeology as a principle of organization. Remember those teetering and seemingly completely disordered stacks of paper on her desk, not organized by time or alphabet or subject, whose only apparent virtue was verticality. Remember how Connie never lost anything in those stacks? But you know what I think? I think Connie had many magics, many methods, but what really made her the gravitational center of the workshop was her empathy. The same force that makes the art, the force the jar desires. Connie's welcoming soul, her lack of judgmentalism, her follow through genuine care, her indefatigable heart, not magic, but humanity. If empathy had an emperor, it would be her. The weight of gratitude in this building and beyond, on all our parts, for one person, Connie, would be crushing if gratitude had mass. But gratitude has no mass, like the contents of the jar. It flies. Here we are. Connie, for once, we are not asking. Here we are, all of us, to thank you and to acknowledge that you are our own jar in Tennessee, from Dye House to Andromeda. Thank you, Connie. You are the deal, and we all know it.
Our next speaker is the novelist, essayist, and critic Francine Prose.
Can you hear me? Among the many things that Connie and I have in common and that we've commiserated about over the years is insomnia. So the other night when I was lying awake in the middle of the night, trying to think what I would say today, I realized that I knew exactly when Connie and I first became friends. We became friends before we ever met. This was over the telephone, which was fitting because so much of our friendship has been conducted over the phone. This was in the late 1980s. I was about to come out to the workshop to teach, and we had many conversations that were just about logistics, where I would live, where my kids would go to school, what course I would teach. And then during one of these conversations, Connie said to me, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "You used to live in Cambridge, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, I said, "I lived there 7 years." She said, "Do you think Cambridge is safe?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah. I mean, I said, yeah." And she said, "Did you feel safe there?" And this was, I mean, over the years, Connie and I have learned to balance reassurance with the cold, hard facts. So, and it seemed to me clear that this was one of the reassurance moments. So I said, "Yeah, I've always felt safe there." And then I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because my daughter, Cammie, is going to go to Harvard, and I just wanted to make sure." And I said, "Oh, yeah, no, it's very safe." And then she said, "But you know, there was a murder there 2 years ago." And at that moment, I knew I could tell this person anything. That this person would never judge me and never accuse me of being a neurotic, like even some of the people who love me have in the past. And we became friends. We became friends before we met. And everything I thought then and more has turned out to be true. That was a terrifying 30 years ago. And in the years since then, we've seen each other as much as we could, but mostly we've talked on the phone. And we've talked on the phone almost always at least once a week, sometimes twice or more a week, depending on how things were going. Sometimes we'd lose touch for a couple of weeks and then always catch up. And during that time, there really was nothing we couldn't talk about. We talked about books, we talked about work, we talked about our families, we talked about our children, we talked about our grandchildren, we talked about births, deaths, we went through everything together. Connie was always a great person to kind of help me, guide me through what I can only describe as sticky social situations. And in fact, one of the things, again, I thought about this in the middle of the night, oddly, was that she was the best person always to help me get out of something I'd agreed to do and just couldn't bear to do. So I would call her and say, I know I'm supposed to go give a reading in Little Rock next week for $1,500, and I can't. I just can't do it. And Connie would say, here's what you say. And I would say it, and it worked. The people seemed not to hate me after I was done, which was what... And then a very peculiar thing happened, which was because, as I said, I was thinking this in the middle of the night. And the next morning, Connie called, and she said, I had the strangest dream last night. And I said, what? And she said, I dreamed that I told Howie, that is my husband, I dreamed I told Howie how you and Howie could get out of coming to my celebration. And of course I said, no, that wasn't one of the things I wanted to get out of. Connie was always great, is always great to gossip with, and she's the greatest person to gossip with because she's so free of malevolence that you never have that kind of icky feeling you feel after gossiping with most people, you know, the way that you can feel sort of unclean after you've been gossiping. Because with Connie, it's just information. It's just information about how people behave in certain situations and who they are. And every bit of gossip, I mean, if I could remember any of it, I'd probably be one of the oldest living repositories of workshop gossip. Every bit of gossip would start, you have to promise not to tell anyone. And I did, I promised, and I didn't tell anyone, and now I can't remember any of it, so I seem to have kept my promise. But along the way, what I realized and have never forgotten and still realize, and why our friendship means so much to me, is that Connie is really a model human being. She's a model human being. I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone who's kinder, who's more generous, who's more conscious in all the best ways, who's more willing to help people, who more desperately wants things to go well for people, to help them solve their problems, large and small. So lying awake in the middle of the night, I realized that I could never possibly say how grateful I am to Connie and how much I love her. And then I thought, it doesn't matter because everyone here will probably know exactly what I mean. Thank you, Connie.
And our final speaker is the novelist and essayist Marilynne Robinson.
Well, I come to you from weeks, perhaps months, of self-imposed, but nevertheless penal seclusion. I'm trying to end a novel that will not end. But what I do, how I sneak away from this isolation, is by listening to the news, which means that there's a certain glassy abstraction about my thinking. It's very moving to me to hear all these wonderful memories that people have about Connie, and I have them too, but the spirit of my particular moment is otherwise absorbed. So what I'm going to do is actually talk about Connie Brothers as a world historical phenomenon. My remarks are brief, but they are deadly serious. Connie Brothers is a person of great consequence, a true phenomenon, as this wonderful gathering demonstrates. Where can we place the limits of her influence when she has contributed to the emergence of so many writers, so very many books, a body of literature that is a presence and an influence globally? No kidding. During the 40 years that I have been an active writer, which approaches the length of Connie's tenure here, I've been aware of the change and growth of the workshop's reputation. Of course, my initial impressions were all as an outsider, hearing what people say, pouring salt on it. In any case, the workshop of the reputation, which was fine to begin with, though dogged by criticisms that were never justified. For example, that it was a conventionalizing force in American literature, that it produced work that was polished but soulless. This notion has always been easily refuted simply by reference to the writers who have passed through here. Over the years, the program has been so consistently productive of work of indisputable interest and value that the old canards are finally overwhelmed by the evidence. These days, very few people inform me that writing cannot be taught. They used to say this because the program was an innovation, unique enough that it was hard to explain what it was we actually do here. Connie is the institutional memory of the workshop in sustaining its culture and in maintaining ties with the writers who have taught and studied here, the larger workshop. Her tact and impartiality, that is, her equal attentiveness to all needs and grievances, and her equal respect for all struggles and aspirations, epitomize what is essential about this place. We live in a moment when institutions are fragile, vulnerable to abuse, or prone to losing their sense of purpose, and even where autocratic orders are, for some reason, having a resurgent popularity. And through it all, the workshop is still the workshop. I am aware of its distinctiveness because wherever I go, people ask me about Iowa, how it is what it is and how it does what it does. I can only describe it to them in terms of the departure from their expectations. It is a part of a big state university in a small city in the Midwest. Though the ratio of applications to admissions is very, very steep, it is still not an elite institution in the usual sense because its ideal student is anyone from anywhere. It derives its status solely from the work of its students. It imposes no academic requirements that would take time away from the essential work of writing. In other words, the impress put on students here is of individuality, an experience of the intellectual and imaginative autonomy good writing demands. I have said things that are familiar and obvious to us all, but in these odd times, when we are governed and represented to the world by loons and buffoons, when a good community stands in stark contrast to what have been at least prevailing trends, that community merits attention. Its example should be consulted. There is a kind of inverse perspective in experience that typically minimizes what is close at hand and magnifies what is distant from us. This place is an important and rather rare demonstration of the fact that autonomy can be bonding, the weft of a strong, productive community. Possibly the best gift Iowa gives us is its history, solid grounds to assume that those among whom we find ourselves are interesting and capable of fine achievements of which even they have only a tentative intuition. They and we all here for, they and we are all here for some reason. In the midst of all the uncertainty, that is a good thing to know. If this assumption could become general in the larger world, life would be better for everyone. My anatomy of the workshop finds Connie Brothers at the heart of it. Her intelligence, discretion, wisdom, and resourcefulness, her great warmth, her sensitivity to the fact that every soul here is trying to find his or her way to the practice of a difficult art. With all the risk and frustration this entails, then exposing their efforts to the criticism of peers, the courage all this requires, and the injury it inevitably involves, from a bad workshop to a rejection to a dismissive review, are all things Connie understands utterly. Among her many gifts is a reliably gentle ability to reassure. She has both sustained and personified an ethos that is vanishingly rare in the world and central to the creation and yearly recreation of this unique community. Connie Brothers is a blessing to us all and, without hyperbole, a blessing to literature.
And now, our next speaker will be Elizabeth Willis, poetry professor. Elizabeth? Oh, good.
This wouldn't be a workshop event without last-minute improvisation. So I told Sam that if it said poetry reading on the program that people were going to think that they were in for another hour and a half, and you're not. Brenda Hillman wrote a beautiful poem for Connie that is going to be available after this event, and I'm going to read it for you. The working sister of the muses. The muses were distracted, so they called their sister in. She flew from the east to the west to the middle. Someone had told her to bring the arrows. Someone had told her to bring libations and bolts of lightning and the charts. She arrived with good cheer and wore her hair long then. She brought a sketch of the weather and the wild hearts. Thus, she worked for decades among stargazers and word makers in a town with green summers and a smooth black angel. She lived among those transfixed by sorrow and desire. She never told them art is the same as not art, because it is not. She never told them not to write the wildest thing in the dark. She never gave the sleepers any reason not to sleep. She never told the silver children not to play. She knew whom to phone from the maze when the word makers made trouble and when the lilies were held high. In summer, the underworld pushed up seeds, and her tall lover grew them as food. In autumn, the pages swelled, and shelves were built, and word makers failed, and some jokes did too. In winter, the hero's epic shield was displayed, and it told all stories except hers. She could see her face in the shield, though she tried to have no face. In spring, she rose early to walk when each leaf caught the sun. She celebrated prizes and mourned the deaths after their songs had gone. She did not cast down the lightning. She did not stamp the sad, harrowing ledgers. She loved the abstract ones, the happy ones, the ragged and the drunk. She told them it was their energy, and their dream energy went on. She was the rosy-fingered sister working for the dawn. I'm going to stay up here for just one more moment. Maybe everyone thinks this way about Connie, but I've always felt that she had a special relationships with poets and with poetry, and that somehow she could see the beauty in this motley tribe with all its surges of annihilating self-blame and over-exuberant ambition, and its desperate desire to be loved. And she loved us and saw through our defenses and inconsolability and taught us something about relation and belonging and the art of being. And we wanted to give her something back, collectively. So we have made this anthology that takes the form of a mobile poetry kit with a year's worth of the verse of the week. And the box was made by book artist Amy Childress, and the poems were all sent in by friends of Connie's and alumni of the workshop, and the poems were typed by current members of the workshop. So it comes in an edition of one. Thank you, Connie.
Just a couple more presents for Connie. Although presents have been pouring into the office. I'm really delighted that this beautiful broadside has been made of Brenda's poem. Letterpress printed by Sherry DeGraw and framed, and I'm very happy that Connie, who has, I think, loved broadsides and had so many of them made of poems, and now has her own broadside. And there will be copies of this available for you when you leave, just that you have a keepsake. And also, the office would like to give Connie some chocolates because she loves chocolates and sweets so much. And so this is from me and Sasha and Deb and Jan and Leah. I'll bring it down to you. Yay. So this is the end of our presentation. I would like to thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank a few people who have been really kind of essential to our planning of this program. The sponsor is Jonathan Goldsmith. The co-sponsors, Donna Guthrie Epstein, Guthrie Grant, and Juliet Mattia. And also, we would like to thank the following people for really helping us as we made these plans. Allison Aaron and Andrea Beeson were extraordinarily helpful at the UI Foundation. We'd also like to thank Cami Brothers, Sherry DeGraw, Robert Hass, Brenda Hillman, Cheryl Jacobson, who made the beautiful program and all of the posters over the years. Sasha Kamelnik, who's basically put together masterminded this afternoon's event. And 1,000 thanks to Jane Van Voorhes, who has been so wonderfully and deeply committed to making this all possible. Thank you very much. And finally, I'd just like everyone to give one more big round of applause to Connie Brothers.